Okay, I promised you a video on Eisenhower and the death of 800,000 German disarmed enemy forces. And so here it is. As World War II was winding down and German defeat was inevitable, it was the matter of what to do with German prisoners of war. The Allied Expeditionary Force had accumulated millions of them. How would they be fed? What would be the fate of Germany? These were questions that were not unanticipated. The decision had been made years earlier to adopt a modification of the Morgenthau Plan, which was to essentially transform Germany into a pasture. What was initially thought was a deindustrialized Germany that could not rise again. There was much antipathy toward the Germans, and Dwight Eisenhower shared in that antipathy. Eisenhower wanted to rough the Germans up even as the war was winding down and German defeat was obvious. This was the general demeanor amongst the Americans who were charged with prosecuting the war. And so there was not much sympathy extended to German POWs. But because of the Geneva Conventions, which sets rules and conditions upon how prisoners of war are treated, Ike and his executives cleverly reclassified the German POWs as disarmed enemy forces so as to escape any constraints of the Geneva Conventions. This was clever sleight of hand. Indeed, this was necessary because the treatment of German DEFs, POWs, was horrific. The German soldiers, and in many cases civilians, were herded into open-air camps without shelter. There were no buildings, there were no latrines. Men went for days without water. They slept in their own sewage. The death rates were horrific as dysentery swept through the camps. James Bakke, in his book Other Losses, documents this horror. Now, there's no escaping it. It happened. There's just too much documentation and too many witnesses to deny it, although our leaders and compliant German leaders certainly tried to do so. And as Bakke points out, there was plenty of food and supplies to avoid these horrific conditions. All right? You may argue the Germans deserved it. That's not the point. The point is that Eisenhower knew what was going on and permitted it. What I'm talking about here is the character of Dwight Eisenhower. The goal here is to dispel in your mind the belief in Eisenhower as this kindly old decent man who is incapable of making decisions which would lead to inevitable death. Now, Americans want to believe that our leaders are good Christian men and capable of heart. Well, they're not good men, and they haven't been for a long time. They're all committed to an American empire that does not work for you. With regard to Eisenhower, he was a tough man, and he was committed to doing everything that he thought was necessary for the Pax Americana he and others worked for their entire lives. Now, you can read Bakke's book yourself, and I can assure you it's far worse than what I've described here. Ike had the will in spades to kill anyone who stood in the way of what his controllers and backers desired. And he had the will in spades to remove John Kennedy from power if he thought Kennedy was a threat to the nation. And he did think that. Now here's some excerpts from Bakke's book, Other Losses. On April 21st, 1945, another SHAEF message, SHAEF stands for Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, signed Eisenhower, told Marshall, that's George C. Marshall, that the new prisoner enclosures will provide no shelter or other comforts. It added that the enclosures would be improved by the prisoners themselves, utilizing local materials. These enclosures were open fields surrounded by barbed wire called Prisoner of War Temporary Enclosures, or PWTE. They were not temporary, but they were certainly enclosed by barbed wire, searchlights, guard towers, and machine guns. Far from permitting the prisoners to provide shelter utilizing local materials, an Army engineer's order issued on May 1st specifically forbade the provision of housing in the cages. If the message to Marshall had meant what it said about the prisoners maintaining themselves with local materials, the engineer's order would never have been issued because it directly countermanded what had just been sent to Marshall. The order was allowed to stand. Tents, food, barbed wire, medical supplies, and so on were scarce in the camps, not because the Army lacked supplies, but because requests for supplies were denied. Now, in April 1945, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, as well as the sick from hospitals, amputees, women auxiliaries, and civilians, were caught. One inmate at Rheinberg was over 80 years old, and another was aged 9. Nagging hunger and agonizing thirst were their companions, and they died of dysentery. A cruel heaven pelted them week after week with streams of rain. Amputees slithered like amphibians through the mud, soaking and freezing. Naked to the skies, day after day and night after night, they lay desperate in the sand of Rheinberg or slept exhaustedly into eternity in their collapsing holes. Now, here is another account from one POW, DEF. We were kept in crowded barbed wire cages in the open with scarcely any food. He has said at his camp at Kripp near Remagen on the Rhine. The latrines were just logs flung over ditches next to the barbed wire fences. To sleep, all we could do was dig out a hole in the ground with our hands, then cling together in the hole. We were crowded very close together. Because of illness, the men had to defecate on the ground. Soon many of us were too weak to take off our trousers first, so our clothing was infected. So was the mud where we had to walk and sit and lie down. There was no water at all at first except the rain. Then after a couple of weeks, we could get a little water from the standpipe. But most of us had nothing to carry it in, so we could only get a few mouthfuls after hours of lining up, sometimes even through the night. We had to walk along between the holes on the soft earth thrown up by the digging, so it was easy to fall into a hole, but hard to climb out. The rain was almost constant along that part of the Rhine that spring. More than half the days we had rain. More than half the days we had no food at all. On the rest, we got a little K-ration. I could see from the package that they were giving us 1/10 of the rations that they had issued to their own men. So in the end, we got perhaps 5% of a normal U.S. Army ration. I complained to the American camp commander that he was breaking the Geneva Convention, but he just said, "Forget the convention, you haven't any rights." Within a few days, some of the men who had gone healthy into the camp were dead. I saw our men dragging many dead bodies to the gate of the camp, where they were thrown loose on top of each other onto trucks, which took them away. One 17-year-old boy who could see his village in the distance used to stand weeping near the barbed wire fence. One morning, the prisoners found him shot at the foot of the fence. His body was strung up and left hanging on the wire by the guards as a warning. The prisoners were forced to walk by the body. Many cried out, "Murderer, murderer." In retaliation, the camp commander withheld the prisoners' meager rations for 3 days. For us, who were already starving and could hardly move because of weakness, it was frightful. For many, it meant death. This was not the only time when the commander withheld rations to punish prisoners. Ouch.